sat on the steps waiting for the bus, and I get a text from KLM to say, after 5 years of you waiting to go back to Japan, your flight is cancelled. Okay, hello and welcome back to the Tokyo Jazz Joints podcast. This is the half century up. This is episode 50. And as I've said before, we never imagined more than one initially, and certainly not 50. So if you're still there and you're still listening, which by all accounts SoundCloud would suggest you are, thank you for sticking with us. And we're back with a raft of new episodes, James, would you say?
A raft? Wow. We're getting very local there. Is it some sort of Irish expression? I would have said myself, actually.
I knew as soon as I said that it was going to be a problem. Anyway, we can go back and cut that out, right?
Is that one of those?
Say hello to people.
It's one of those pub house jazz Kisoten things? Oh, sorry. That's an inside joke, listeners. Yeah,
I think you mean public house. Anyway, yeah.
A plethora of episodes. I'm great, man. I'm so happy to be talking jazz stuff with you again, although it seems like ages since you've been here.
Well, I mean, this is a funny thing, right? Because, I mean, it's only been, I think, like 3 weeks, but it already feels like a long time. And yeah, so it's a reunion podcast in many ways, not least because we're back together on the mic, but also, obviously, if you follow any of our activity on social media, you will realize that I have just recently been in Japan. And what we're going to look at in the next sort of 12, 13 episodes of the podcast is what happened on that trip and some of the places that we went to. Some places I went on my own that James had been to, some places that we went together, and then a couple other places that I managed to get to with other people. And, you know, hopefully at some point James will be able to visit too, but it started quite dramatically, the trip, didn't it? Well, not for you, just for me.
No, are you kidding? I was absolutely riveted. Philip, I was constantly refreshing KLM's flight tracker website, you know, once I heard that you were going to be, what was it up to, about 16 hours delayed, I think?
I mean, it was grim. So just for context, you might have seen this on Instagram, but basically I was sitting on the steps of Dublin, of Custom House Key in Dublin, and which is where you get the bus now to the airport, because I'd taken the train down from Belfast for rather boring reasons. But anyway, I wasn't in a car, so sat on the steps waiting for the bus, and I get a text from KLM to say, after 5 years of you waiting to go back to Japan, your flight is cancelled. And all my years of traveling and all the flights I've taken, I've never had a flight cancelled in that way. So at first you just can't quite comprehend. You're like, no, because no, that can't be right. Because like I'm booked to go on this flight tomorrow. No. And then slowly you start to realize. So the bus literally pulled up as this happened. So I thought, well, look, there's no better place to sort this out than an airport. Maybe there's a desk there. I can figure it out quicker. So I got on that bus and then couldn't wait any longer. So I called KLM. And like, in fairness to KLM, I must say, especially if they want to sponsor the podcast, you know, they got onto it pretty quickly, and they got me on a flight. But unfortunately, not the following day. It was the day after. So I managed to persuade them to go to Amsterdam. I flew to Amsterdam that evening as planned, and it meant hanging out in Amsterdam for an extra day, which, you know, is not the worst thing, of course, but like when you're just itching to go to Japan, and especially after so long, it just feels like slightly torturous. But anyway, I got there on the Sunday. Actually, no, I got there on the Monday evening. The original idea was I'd fly on the Friday, arrive on the Sunday morning, and you know, have a couple of days to decompress. But as it turned out, I spent my time in Amsterdam, and so when I finally arrived at the hotel in Shibuya, 2 days late on the Monday evening, it was about 7. I think I checked in, probably already had a row with the reception about something. And then about 15 minutes later, my phone rang, and it was obviously you in reception. So I mean, it's the literal definition of hitting the ground running, don't you think?
I mean, not only that, but I mean, in between you texting me from Amsterdam, letting me know the new schedule, because, we'd had plans on Sunday to have a real, a relaxed reunion, catch up with some food and drink and plan out your
Yep.
whole trip here.
Yep.
Instead, it was like, okay, I'll be at the hotel around 7 and I'll be up at 7 the next morning to hit the road to Tohoku. So it was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, so you got 12 hours in Tokyo. That's fine. We'll do what we need to do. But and in any case, a very warm and tearful reunion in the hotel lobby. I can't remember the name of the place you stayed, but no more free.
Well, I wish you hadn't cried, but I mean, we got through it. Actually, funny enough,
you were like my
funny
daughter
enough,
with your Instagram live all set up as soon as we got into.
Still available, by the way, on Instagram. Well, funny enough, actually, talking of crying, I mean, I'm quite an emotional person at the best of times, but I mean, it may have been the 14.5 hour flight, but when I got off literally the second I got off the plane in Tokyo and onto that sort of weird gangway thing that connects the plane to the terminal, I just burst into tears. I was so emotional. I was so happy to be back because, it's corny, but there is a sense of coming home because, 20 years I lived there, which was at that time, certainly when I left, was far and away the majority of my adult life. So, it was just a very emotional experience. And I suppose it's not having been able to go back because of COVID and all the restrictions and everything like that, when you finally get there, and especially then, of course, having that final cliffhanger with the flights and so on. It was just a beautiful thing. And I think probably in hindsight, it was the best way to do it. So we hit the ground running. It was somewhere in Shibuya, like Hotel Wing or something like that. I was staying, but we headed out to what was a legendary place, right? But it's still legendary, but in name only, because obviously the place that we went to for the first evening is a kind of a resurrection or a reiteration of a classic jazz kisa, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And, a place that we have mentioned a couple times before here and there. One of my old favorites from the days when I first started kind of wandering around looking at all the jazz joints. And it's Masako version 2. Moscow was one of the oldest, if not I have to double check that because a couple different sources cite different dates, but it either dates back to 1954 or 1956, which would place it first or second of the oldest jazz kisa that were remaining for a long time, along with one of our favorites, Charmant. And Masako was just a tiny alleyway, about 1 minute walk from Shimokitazawa Station, and unusually because in those days, remember Shimokita is for our listeners outside of Japan, it's a few stations away from Shibuya, so it's a residential neighborhood, but it's one of those neighborhoods that in the 1960s became sort of the seat of the counterculture in Tokyo. A lot of theaters, a lot of cinemas, and of course jazz joints, And Masako herself, the owner, became this legendary figure. She was friends with a whole range of jazz musicians from Japan and overseas. And I remember, Philip, the first time when I went in there, this would have been way, way back, probably about 1999 or 2000. And it was sort of like, a big wing of a house. And when you walked in,
that's
the
right.
Entryway, the original Masako had this gigantic oil painting of Masako herself with Mal Waldron. And anybody who listens to my show knows how much I love Mal. So I was immediately like, oh my God, this is the coolest joint I've ever seen. But sadly, the original Masako closed. She passed away in the early 90s. And I think it was her brother that took it over. And, as you know, you lived in Shimokitazawa. There's constant gentrification going on, and the place closed down.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too, just, because obviously being back there, as you say, I lived there, and each time you go back, it's kind of more and more unrecognizable. I mean, it feels the same in some ways, but for me, very much the atmosphere in the station has just changed a little bit because they've kind of hollowed out the center, which, is quite a common thing in Tokyo. They've got a lot of these new buildings and these kind of like Furiai communication spaces that aren't always used. And there's quite a few parking lots and things like that have kind of been put in where there was a lot more atmospheric, places and little alleyways and places to eat. And of course, actually, when you go to the edge of that kind of major redevelopment around the station, you can still see quite a few old style Japanese houses. And Masako was one of those, because it just where Masako, like, had Masako been like, 50 or 100 meters further down the hill from the station, it may still be there, but just specifically where it was, obviously it was kind of like first on the list to be knocked down and that area to be redeveloped. And it's such a shame, because I also remember going in, I think I was only ever in once before it disappeared, but I remember very clearly going in there, and probably at that time was not tuned into Jazz Kisa and not thinking, oh, this is this, and maybe not even listening to that much jazz at the time, but like it's sort of a regret and a relief that at least I was there once, but also a regret that I didn't like appreciate it more. And of course, obviously didn't have the foresight to at the time like photograph it, because we do see traces of it in places we go, in matchbooks and cards, and of course they still the new place still uses the logo and of course the mysterious picture of this. I feel like this is going to go back to the lack of nautical knowledge, but this time it's about animals, but some form of primate / monkey, which I believe at the time the owner owned, right? I mean, there was actually
that's right. Moscow was quite quite infamous, I suppose you would say, for strolling the streets of Shimokitazawa with her monkey / chimpanzee.
I think it's got to be something more docile than that. But
it's really interesting, because when you go back and sometimes when I'm visiting any random jazz kisa around town and flipping through the old magazines, you'll come across articles and features about Moscow herself and the place, and they always make mention of the monkey, but I've never been able to understand exactly. I mean, look, things were a lot more loosey-goosey back in Tokyo in those days, right? So I'm imagining she didn't go through any sort of animal licensing or whatever.
Seems highly unlikely, right?
Everybody just sort of like took it in stride. It was like, oh yeah, Moscow, yeah, she's got a monkey. It's like, oh, okay, that's pretty.
But actually, that area is, I mean, like, again, living there, I mean, there was a guy quite often who had a ferret that he used to sit at cafes with a ferret. And I also, a couple of times on Chazawa Dori there, which is what the road that connects Shimokitazawa to Sangenjaya, there was also someone who had a Shetland pony that they used to walk around as well. So, I mean, in a way, it was really part of a bigger, slightly problematic animals in tiny apartments movement at the time. But anyway,
yes.
If anyone knows the origin
anyone
story,
who's been to a zoo in Japan would probably know what we're talking about. But yes, that's a topic for the other animal rights podcasts we do. But anyway, when Moscow closed, it's funny you said that about when you went and maybe not being like that, clued into the world yet. I mean, I was sort of just diving in, and if I had known sort of what an important figure she was and what an important place it was, I would have done a lot more, investigating and tried to talk to the staff and all that. But in those days, I was basically just sort of sitting in the corner and, having a couple beers and just taking my own personal notes, never really thinking that 20 years later I'd still be talking about it. And certainly, when it was, when I first heard that there was a new Masako and that it was in Shimokitazawa, I got really excited. I didn't know anything of the details. All I had heard from someone was that, they found, a new place, it's been closed for about like 5-6 years, or more than that, actually, maybe almost close to 10 years. And, but it's been reopened. And that was literally the only thing I heard. And it took me a while to get down there. And once I did, I found out it was strange. It was one of those moments, Philip, when you realize like the two or three strands of your music worlds are coming together, because the current owner of Moscow is the wonderful Moiko-san, who not only used to work in the original when she was a teenager and a college student, and said, oh yeah, I'm sure I'd served you beer at some point in those years back. But she's also a member of the amazing group, the Minyo Crusaders, who not only have I had the chance to write about and see in concert many times, but they've been blown up around the world. They've toured in Europe, they've toured in the States, and so it was sort of like once I found out that it was her who not only worked at the original but now was like running the new one, and she was a member of the band. It was one of those mind-blowing moments where it was like, oh, this is just perfect. And so I immediately ran down there and went in, and it's a lot cozier than the original. It's a small room. It's maybe maybe about 15 seats in total, and they're very, very close together. But the main feature is as soon as you walk in, along the whole right wall is just this, from floor to ceiling, all the original vinyl from Masako they were able to keep. And it's an absolute library, a treasure of original jazz records.
And it sort of feels, I'm just actually just pop. I mean, if you're interested in seeing more Masako, and particularly the current owner's penchant for holding up record sleeves and then posing, and I love what she does with these. Some of them are so clever, the way she kind of merges herself into like a record sleeve cover. But on the bio, actually, on Instagram, which is Jazz Kisa Masako, we've even got the day, James. So it's actually 1953. And it's June the 9th, 1953 was the official opening date. And then the 24th of September, 2009 is when they closed. Yeah. So then the reopening was, well, like you said, it was just less, it was a few years ago, right? Wasn't it?
Yeah. It was only about 4 years ago. And one of the reasons that it took so long was that there was, well, Philip, you lived here a long time, and you know that sometimes when you talk business in Japan, it's like entering a maze, okay? Because it's very hard to get a straight answer about, well, what exactly happened to the shop? Well, and then what happened to all the stuff, and like who owns it? And so the story was very long and vague, and all I could get out of it was that a lot of the original stuff from Masako, including those beautiful oil paintings, ended up with somebody in Hokkaido. And apparently that's where the great Mal Waldron one is. But Moiko and her team were able to get a whole bunch of them. Not everything, but as you saw when you went there, some of the stuff that's on the walls is from the original, including all of the old pottery. Not all of that was redone. So they were able to save quite a bit of it.
Yeah, I mean, this was the first time that I've been in the new one, and I'm trying to pull up some photos on my phone from the night that we went, because there was quite a few notable paintings and things like that up there. But I think for me, like, it really felt like the old place. It just felt like a smaller version. Like it very much had, like, it's a newer building, but it had that same feel and that same atmosphere. Is incredible how you can kind of recreate that, even with just some of the things that had survived from the previous place. So, and I think what was also notable was that when we were there, and I may have imagined this because I was heavily jet lagged, and my memories of that evening, although I felt very present at the time, feel a little more vague now. But, I think there was almost exclusively, I think there was one non-Japanese couple that came in for a drink, but other than that, all the customers, and of course including the master, were female, which, again, as we've said many times in the podcast, is not a usual situation. And there was 2 or 3 young women who were there just on their own, reading, having a drink, or eating some food, and listening to the music. And I suppose that kind of speaks to not only maybe the owner being female, but obviously just how, some of these newer places, these newer joints, are kind of a little more forward looking, and they're certainly projecting and providing maybe like a more open atmosphere than what is the traditional jazz kisa. And I know we're probably going to get onto that in other episodes, because we had a few interesting conversations about exactly the ambience and the kind of image in the popular imagination that jazz kisa brings up. But for me, like, it was just, there was that beautiful painting of Eric Dolphy. There was a signed photograph of Billy Harper. And like, it just felt so like cozy. It was such a nice way to start that first evening. And of course,
and it was, and Philip, it was great because it was also one of those, and I mean, it's happened so many times, but every time it happens, it makes me want to smile. Is that because we were talking about Billy Harper and the album, and as soon as the record playing ended, the next thing we knew, like, she put on a Billy Harper record. So she was listening to us, go on and on. And, we've had that many times with owners who are, maybe you don't know if they speak English or not, but they catch the names of who you're talking about, and all of a sudden, like, one of those artists' records will come on. But just to go back for one quick point, though, about the, yes, the customers, there being a lot of female customers, and Moiko-san obviously owning the place and running it. And I think that, that is maybe a small growing trend, but certainly in the location, because in Shimokitazawa, as you know very well, so many alleyways full of tiny, tiny shops, whether clothing or books or knickknacks or whatever, little drinking bars. And a very high percentage of them are owned and run by women. And so I think it's an area that sort of takes pride in that they do have their own sort of unique culture. People look out for each other. And of course, Moeko-san, having worked in the original, has a relationship with a lot of the old customers as well. And so I think that's sort of like all comes together. It made perfect sense to me that it would be, in Shimokita, and that it would be her who would be able to sort of like take it over and bring in to bring in younger customers as well, not just, female customers, but people under the age of 50, like yourself.
Yeah. And I think also that was kind of the interesting thing too, because quite a lot of the music that she was playing was I suppose kind of newer, spiritual kind of jazz, some with kind of beats and that sort of stuff. So it was even the music choice, I thought, was quite not forward looking, because nothing retrogressive about some of the stuff that was also being played, but like just, it feels like it's updating. Whereas again, we maybe know that like a lot of those record collections in further flung places that we are, or much older places, are probably not being updated in the same way that they maybe would have been, in their heyday. But just looking through some of the photos as well, there's which is something maybe quite rare that we've not seen very often, is a Charles Mingus signed photograph, which is not something we've come across so much. And there's also a beautiful kind of like
based on what I remember reading when I went through a huge Mingus phase, and still am a big fan, but maybe not the jolliest of guys to ask for an autograph.
Right, that's kind of what I thought. Yeah,
so you don't see them nearly as much as you would see, some of the more, Horace Silver or Elton Jones, who were known for their beautiful smiles.
But we'll put some of these photos up on Instagram when this episode comes out. But, there's a beautiful collage of kind of collage style picture of Alice Coltrane. And obviously then, of course, when we started chatting about photography and I asked to take some pictures, then this photo album came out with, this beautiful signed photo of Ron Carter. There's photos of Miles. And of course, just to go back to Billy Harper, which again, we'll also put this up on the Instagram, is a lot of the famous matchbooks that Masako had. And there is actually just this incredible one that they made with Billy Harper, I think, on one side, and then on the other side is the Masako monkey playing a saxophone.
Yeah,
so
I forgot about that.
Unless I'm hallucinating because of the jet lag, I have the photographic record, so I'm pretty sure that happened.
I forgot about that, but that is great. No, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of matchbooks, coasters, and advertisements in the magazines featuring the little guy or gal that used to be the mascot. So just, and it's just again, it's great because I'm a fan of any new places that open. They all have their own unique charms to them, but there is something special about having the legacy, having the history, having that continuation. And, it just means that, a whole new generation of people are going to get to experience this world, which is what it's all about. Speaking of new, though, Shimokita has, we mentioned about all the redevelopment, but if you just walk a little bit away, you can still find some of the old charm. And our next place, Philip, how would we...
Oh, hang on a minute. Whoa. Slow down. I think you're missing something very major. Before we left Masako, an unprecedented thing occurred because...
I didn't have this in my...
Any regular listeners of the podcast will know that James has what I would say borders, and may not even border, may just be a fully blown phobia of any kind of food or snacks in a jazz kisa or a jazz bar. And not only did he try some of the delicacies this time, he ordered, and this has just blew my mind. And again, without the photographic record, I may have been just hallucinating from jet lag, but James, you had a full curry dinner in Masako, which, I'm looking at the photograph now. It's unprecedented. It's unbelievable.
Very, very easy to explain. Very easy to explain.
Thought it
Long
might
day
be.
at work, been hours since lunch, went out of my way to be a good friend and go pick you up at the hotel, which meant navigating the
True.
streets of Shibuya and Sentogai. So by the time we sat down at Moscow at around 8, definitely was a little bit peckish, as you would say. But most importantly, and again, bless her heart, Moiko-san cooked up what was a proper curry. I don't mean Japanese sweet curry of the kind that you would gobble up anywhere. I mean like proper and, as in Indian. And me being part Indian, that's, something that's going to wet my palate a little bit. So I decided
And
to
you
order
liked
a
it.
meal.
Come on,
Didn't
you
think
enjoyed that.
it was very tasty, I have to admit, and I did not see it as being in any way momentous. I mean, over 5 years of visiting 150 plus jazz joints, I'm certain I've eaten at least a few peanuts here and there.
I don't know. I don't remember
maybe it
them
was
if you
the first
did, but
actual meal. Maybe it was the first actual meal. But what can I say? I mean, it smelled really good, and yeah. So I decided to dive in. Hey, we adapt, we change. It had been 5 years since you'd been here. We're not the same.
it's a new. It's. I'd say it's potentially a new era. But look, just for the benefit of people listening, we went to about.
It's
well, I think
definitely a new weight class. I'll tell you that.
well, like I went to about. I think in the end it was 30 places. I managed to get around in about 13 days, which was no mean feat. And never really stopped the entire time, but some of it we're going to cover chronologically because we went down to Kansai for a few days together, and but we're going to jump around a little bit. So I think where you were going was probably to stay in Shimokitazawa, but we were going to go to another place that serves not only jazz but food. Right? Is that what you were thinking?
That is correct. Before you so rudely interrupted my wonderful, wonderful transition. Yes, a brand new place. Maybe one of the smallest I think that you and I have been to, and perhaps one of the smallest that exists. With the unbelievably unique name of Tonlist, 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 which, if we were live, I would have a call-in quiz, but since we're recording a podcast, that won't work. Philip, though, you do not know what the word Tonlist means or what language it comes from, do you?
Yeah, it's from Icelandic, and it's a famous music program in Iceland. So, so screw you. Smart arse.
It simply means music in Icelandic. But what I wasn't aware of was I mean, when you think of a shop that says it's going to feature jazz and the main thing on the menu is going to be hot dogs. Well, being American, my first thought will be, oh, this is going to be a Yankee Joe type place with, Route 66 neon signs in it or whatever. We're going to get the real full American experience like we did at another place we'll talk about on an upcoming episode. But no, yeah, it's Icelandic. And apparently hot dogs are quite the thing in Iceland. I've not known that. I've never been there.
Well, I famously have, of course, but and had actually. There's a famous.
I didn't think we were going to go into that.
Well, again, for the listeners of the podcast, as you know, I may have referenced many times a wife, and we did actually get married in Iceland. We're no longer married, and they are a big thing, hot dogs. And funny enough, it's only now that you're talking about that I kind of also made that connection to Iceland, because the owners seem to have this. There's a famous photography book of which follows this kind of pipeline across Iceland. And actually, on the wall of Tonlist, he has an original print by the Icelandic photographer. So there seems to be this very kind of like strong connection with Iceland. And when I chatted to him, I asked him, obviously, have you been there? And of course he had. But I do remember there's a particularly famous place in Reykjavik where I think there's footage of I think Obama or Clinton or some US president anyway had been down there, and so there's all these photographs of them getting hot dogs down there, closer to the water in Reykjavik. So yeah, it's like quite a big thing there, weirdly. But I've only just made that connection. The Icelandic thing.
It is really, really interesting because when you look at the shop and I've done some reading about it and the notes I had from when I briefly chatted with him, the guy's a big audio guy. Now, our regular listeners know Philip and I are not audio guys. We appreciate it, but we can't go rattling off about very obscure pieces of equipment and whatnot. But the owner at Tonlist, he mentioned that it goes back to his father, who was a jazz collector and also a big audio guy, and he started to sort of appreciate this jazz world, and really wanted to create a small kind of modern, slightly different version of it. And then, I think the whole idea of the hot dogs on the menu is just oh, look, Philip, we've mentioned it before. I mean, there's a lot of jazz places that we'll be doing an upcoming podcast on this, but Jazz Plus, whether it's hot dogs or cars or wine or whatever, but this was a first where, I mean, the menu, we're not joking, the menu is just 5 types of hot dogs. That's it.
Oh yeah.
That's all he makes. And there's a little fridge with some beers and a couple other things. But pretty much the whole place is a couple tiny tables, 3 or 4 seats at a very narrow counter. And then behind the counter is where he cooks it up. And then in the back corner, where a whole wall of audio and records. I think it's definitely, by square footage, the smallest shop that we've been to, and one of the smallest I've been to in Japan. But it's an absolute gem. And I mean, in the only 5 months he's been open, I must have seen 50 plus notices on Twitter from both Japanese Jazz Kisa fans and overseas visitors who have gone there, and everybody's raved about it. So I think he's, hopefully doing enough good business that he's going to stay for a while. But yeah, it was a bit of a shock too, because Philip, remember where Tonlist is located is in a little alleyway. In Japanese they call it yokocho, and a yokocho is a sort of a narrow street with tons of tiny little counter bars or places to eat. The kind of things you see in pictures of old Tokyo with the red lanterns hanging. The real evocative sort of Showa era stuff.
Yeah,
so
and it's actually
Tonlist is.
And actually in there's a couple of, you mentioned earlier, but I think, there still is quite a few smaller theaters in Shimokitazawa, and I think it was definitely a sort of an off Broadway kind of area back in the day. So the kind of, it's probably the last remaining part of Shimokitazawa now that really has that age. There's a few bars and places around there, and it's in a kind of it's like a covered space, and it's funny, it stands out because of its newness too, because it's very clean and very slick inside. I mean, it almost has that, now that you sort of think of it, has that kind of Scandi Icelandic vibe to it, and it has like a neon sign outside with hot dog, and a nice glass door, and it's very brightly lit and like really nice space. But so it really stands out because a lot of the other places much dingier and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, you sort of leave and you just think, like, this is genius, because when I had actually tried to contact him on Instagram the day before, just to say, oh look, I'm coming, I'm going to be passing through, I used to live there, we're going to come for some food, but would it be okay to photograph? And when I got in, I said to him, I've tried to contact you on Instagram, and he obviously hadn't seen it, which I guessed, and so we sat down, ordered some food, and got chatting. And again, like, to go back to the audio, I mean, he said, well, I'm a big fan of UK audio, and I sort of nodded as if like I understood what that meant. But he was playing some records, and I mean, the sound was just so crisp and so clear. And then he got the hot dogs. We ordered a couple of hot dogs, and again, even that is it's such a simple idea, because all you have to do is boil them, toast the bun. There's no smoke, there's no oil, there's no splash, there's no mess, and you're just sitting there at this little kind of diner type counter that's so familiar to like anyone who's been in like a ramen shop or like any kind of izakaya. And this jazz is just playing so loudly, and you're just sitting eating this hot dog, and you're thinking, this is genius. I mean, this is like, and actually when I asked him, I said to him, how did you come up with this idea? And he just looked at me and he was like, well, and he was quite reserved, and he was like, well, I just always wanted to open like a jazz kisa. And then I also really like hot dogs. And then he just sort of stopped. And I was like, so you just thought you'll combine them both? And he was like, yeah, basically. Like, so he just loved two things, and he thought, well, I'll just do them both together. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, it seems so simple when you say it, right? And then it has this kind of Icelandic connection too. I mean, it's just a unique space.
Perfect. Yeah, I remember he's a little bit reserved, I guess you would
Yeah,
say.
absolutely. Yeah.
Friendly, but reserved. And but I mean, how it's beautiful because when you think about all of the places that we've been, where we've talked with owners who have a sort of, I don't want to use the phrase tunnel vision because that's very negative. But let's just say they are very, very clear in what their interests are.
Yeah.
Jazz, collecting jazz vinyl, audio, and maybe one other thing, be it whiskey
Mm.
or chain smoking all day or whatever it is, and they very often can live their life in this lane and be very, very happy, blissed out about it.
Mm.
Yeah, when I first went and realized that was the other thing, that it was hot dogs. I didn't even know what to ask him. I was like, okay, you know what? I've seen everything in Japan. This is great. It's a jazz hot dog joint.
It was brilliant. It's just brilliant. And actually,
by the way, I didn't eat one though. So
well,
just to stay consistent.
Baby steps. But like, I mean, actually, funny enough, the next day I got a really lovely message from him on Instagram. His name is actually Yuya Uno. And shout out to him and for creating such a great place, and actually also really good hot dogs, by the way. But I got a lovely message, and he was apologizing because he was worried that my girlfriend felt uncomfortable because we were speaking Japanese, and obviously that wasn't the case. But he apologized for that, and he said, look, if you want to come back, please do. And it was just lovely, to get that message and to be able to eat there, to have a drink, to photograph there. And like, again, like you said, and also just, again, to go back to that idea of, the future of jazz kissa and jazz sort of listening spaces, and how, perhaps it's these ones that evolve and adapt that are the ones that are really going to survive and thrive, hopefully, and he was very sort of erudite about, I said, how's things going? Is business good? And, again, just very typical answer of like, yeah, it's okay, which probably means it's not, it's actually not bad at all, because it's quick, it's easy, it's a small space.
From his manner and from, sort of also the Japanese business owner reticence to, I mean, I've lost count of the number of times of owners telling me like, oh, business is so bad, I don't know how I'm going to stay open. And they've been open for like 30 years and they're never closing it. You know what I mean? So there's that sort of like pattern to that, which is okay. Which actually leads us then to our last place, Philip, which is basically completely the opposite of Tonelist.
Yeah. And also at the other end of Tonelist, we went separately, obviously, but the next place we went together, and this was, I think, the penultimate night of my trip, wasn't it? I had some plans to meet some friends for dinner, and we did a classic sort of, you were on your way home from work, or no, you came up from your house, and I did a kind of a dash down for a couple of hours, and we went to Step, right?
That's right. Step in the town of Motosumiyoshi, which is in Kawasaki City. Kawasaki is the rather drab industrial town in between Tokyo and Yokohama. So it's sort of perfect for both of us because I was coming up from Yokohama. And, it's really interesting because I had been to this station before, to the now closed bar Flow, which was a lovely, lovely nighttime jazz bar. But I had in my notes, because I take notes about every station that I go to, what are the music bars there and all of that. And I had written down very clearly Motosumiyoshi bar, jazz bar Flow, nothing else of interest. And sure enough, I felt incredibly stupid because the very, very classic old jazz kissa Step is there, not even that far from the station, but one of those, as we love to say, very analog places. No website. I don't even know if the guy has a cell phone, although he certainly has a computer. We'll get into that in a little bit. But one of those places that is not really that well known. There's very little online in Japanese about it. I recall seeing a blog post from about 2011 or 12. So we weren't even really sure if it was still open. And Philip, do you remember we were looking for clues, and the only clue we could see that it had been open in the last couple of years was it had that little like sort of rainbow sticker that says COVID ventilation accredited that Japanese shops got a couple years ago. You know the one that I mean?
Yeah, and I'd had a slight panic too because I'd been looking on Google Maps, and sometimes you get photos there from users and things, and something happened in like between the day that we arranged to go and the day that we were going, and like suddenly this new photo had appeared on Google Photos, and it was just a shutter. And so like, and I was like, oh, this has been like updated, and maybe this photo that which was of Step and was recognizably Step with the COVID thing was there, and then suddenly the most recent photo was the shutter. So I was kind of half expecting to get there and it to be gone. And of course, when we got there and turned in off the main street and it was down the end of a little small kind of alley, he was out there cleaning the windows and getting the sign ready, wasn't he?
And how would you describe his manner as we approached you with your gigantic camera in hand?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna have to post a picture of my actual camera just to dispel that myth. But yeah, I mean, it was funny because we were obviously on a bit of a schedule, and he just kind of turned it, and we were like, oh, we're here because like so many places, owners kind of maybe turn around and see us, and they don't necessarily think that we're coming to them, right? And so we were like, oh, are you open? And he was like, well, I'm not quite open yet. And we were like, we did that kind of thing. We just go, okay. And then there's sort of a pause, and he was like, it's fine, like just come in. And actually he was just about to open. I mean, it wasn't hours. I think it was 5 or something like that. So yeah, he kind of brought us in. And, as we've found so many times, once we sat down, sort of introduced ourselves, started to have a bit of a chat, he just opened up completely. And, he started to tell us, he said, I made a note or something that he said that he'd been somewhere nearby for 10 years. And this current place was there for 43 years. And I also, on the way home, made this note of like, I think it just sums up, that how many of these places and how huge that network of these kind of places was and still is, because of the fact that, neither of us were aware of this. And not only that, it's kind of on your way home and you had never even been to it, which just to me could have exemplified just like the scale of like this culture and just how many places that, there are, and whether you would ever even get around all of them anyway, because it wasn't like a new place. It's like, oh, I'd never heard of that. He's been doing the same thing there for 43 years, just exactly. In that little space, right?
Oh, exactly. And the other thing being like, it's not like I just do this like randomly as a hobby. Like this is what I do for years. Like I take notes and I check Google Map, and it's like, how did I miss this? And what I realized actually, Philip, after we had visited and after you left, one reason was because when you look for Step, and you would remember you went there, you get a lot more information about the bar Step in Kanda, the sort of large,
yes, of course, large
basement place, not nice place, in Kanda. So and he's got a website, he's got social media, whatever. So I'm assuming that maybe even if I had seen the name, if you don't look closely, and I mean, I read Japanese, but I'm not a native speaker, and it's easy to just like miss something. Maybe I just saw Step and I would have thought, oh yeah, I've been there already, So it's very likely I would have seen some mention of it by, maybe one of our sort of, co-Jazz Kisa Hunter friends or acquaintances or something online on Twitter or wherever. But for whatever reason, it sort of fell through the cracks. And so to finally get there and then sit down and talk with him. And, he did that. He always, that always kind of like, humble, rather charming thing. Like, oh, my place is so dirty. Let me clean up before you take pictures. No. Don't touch anything. We're fine.
Yeah. It was funny, wasn't it? Because he was, it's never the intention to sort of highlight these things. I mean, I just want to photograph what's there. But yeah, he had mentioned that he'd thought, I think, quite seriously about closing during COVID. And for whatever reason, he kept going. And I think over the course of COVID, particularly perhaps his tables weren't being used and stuff by groups of customers or whatever, that slowly stuff had kind of started to pile up there, and there was quite a lot of stuff just sitting around, like piles of papers and like magazines and stuff like that. But there was this beautiful little bar area, and actually as we were there, another young guy came in. I say another young guy as if we're young, but a young guy came in and had a drink, and it seemed like he maybe comes there a bit on his way home or something like that. So we just sat and we weren't there that long, and I had to shoot off a little earlier, but he was, of course, a big Crusaders fan. And he, once he got that on again, he really sort of was like, he played that album, particular Scratch, which seemed to be one of his favorites, which a couple of days later, when I was in another shop, it popped up. So I thought, well, look, that's a nice memory, and I picked up that album.
He was also, Philip, after you left. He was talking a little bit more about his speakers, about his JBL 075, and how they'd never once had a problem in 45 years. And then, yeah, it was interesting because you mentioned the sort of younger guy who seemed like he'd been there many times before. But after you left, an older gentleman came in, didn't even say anything, just sat down next to me, took his newspaper and cigarettes out, and the owner just pulled his bottle keep from under the counter and poured him like a whiskey soda, and they just nodded to each other. So I was like, oh, okay, this guy's here at least once or twice a week. So very much a neighborhood kind of joint. In the back of a strange sort of location, it was an old sort of shopping building, like right next to Step was some sort of weird discount drugstore, not a chain. And then next to that was one of those old sort of post-war Showa era toy stores, I think. So it was very, a hard place to get to. I don't think you would have a lot of people walking by. It's going to be mostly regulars. But I'm going to have to make sure on the way home someday to stop by again, because it was, he was just such a friendly guy. And, again.
And also he was teaching himself to learn GoPro camera, right? And at one point there was that moment where he was like, have a look at this thing. And we were like, oh, he's going to show us a whole load of videos that he's made with GoPro, but it didn't work out that way. But we were like, yeah, oh, that's great. Keep going with that. And trying to sort of encourage him to use this like technology, but it was delightful. I mean, he just was like, oh, I've really got into this and making videos for I think he said he was making them for his son, right? It was kind of a posterity type thing. So I think he wanted to kind of create these videos.
I think he sort of, it was strange. It's interesting because he, like I mentioned, quite an analog place, no real use of anything online, but here he was sort of working with pretty advanced equipment online and trying to like make some sort of record of the shop. And I think it may have been maybe for a sadder reason than that, though. I don't know if you remember, he mentioned his wife had been quite ill. And so she'd been feeling better, but that was another reason that he wasn't doing as many hours in the shop. It used to be, regular Jazz Kisa hours open in the afternoon, but these days he was just opening, and of course because of COVID, now he was just keeping it open basically like 5 to 10, so 5 hours a day. And I think he lived fairly close by, so because he had to go back to her, he said that to me. He doesn't really keep it open very late. But a great spot, and another one of our sort of random ones, because as you mentioned, we didn't have plans that day. We had plans for the weekend before you were going to fly back. But you texted me just being like, hey, I think I can get away for an hour before some boring thing I'm going to, and I was like, okay, I'll finish work a little bit early. Let's just zoom up and walk around and see if we can find this joint. And sure enough, we did it.
Yeah. And look, I think that's probably a good spot to finish up this particular reunion episode in more ways than one. We'll be back with we're planning another 10, 12 episodes. So and they'll be coming out probably fortnightly, which in normal English is every 2 weeks. So keep an eye out for those. And thank you for your continued support. There'll also be updates on the book as well. So keep an eye on those on Kickstarter and Instagram. And we will probably visit that in a little more detail in the next episode as well. So that was the half century, 50 episodes up. James, I wonder if we'll make it to 100.
Are you kidding? I think we're going to make it to 200. We still got so many more places to visit, man. And that's a fair point to talk about. Come on.
That's a fair point.
Put your ambitions high.
Well, look, listen, for now, it's been, not only was it very, very happy occasion for us to be sitting not only in Mexico, but all those places that we sat that we're going to talk about in the next episodes. I mean, it was just, I think there was moments where we just kind of sat and went, and there's a couple of times where I was like, what are you smiling at? And you were like, just happy. And it was like just such a lovely thing. And also to be able to talk about it and like debrief on all the places we've been. I'm really looking forward to the next 10, 12 episodes. But for now, that's all for episode 50. And keep an eye out on the website too. Slowly but surely, some of those photos will be going up there as well. But in the meantime, James, I will talk to you in 2 weeks' time.
Yes, that's correct. In 2 weeks' time. Talk to you soon, buddy.
See you later.